Okay, good afternoon everyone. Firstly, many thanks to Gianluca for warming you all up as we now embark on a discussion on image rights. My name is Matt Bloomford. I'm an associate in the sports group of Maples and Calder. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Maples panel session on image rights. Winston Churchill once said, "A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, an optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty." In our discussions this afternoon, we're going to explore the commercial opportunities associated with image rights and the perceived difficulties in realising and maximising their value. We hope that whether you're a club, a player, an agent or a commercial partner, you'll leave this room with fresh optimism for the future and new ideas to explore when you return to the office. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce you to our special ones. Starting from the far right, we have Andrew Dart. Andy is an image rights expert. He recently set up his own company, having left his role as head of commercial partnerships at Chelsea Football Club, where he oversaw the club's acquisition of their players' image rights and their commercial exploitation. Sitting next to Andy is Fraser Reid. Fraser is a partner at Couchman's, the leading sports business law firm. He specialises in advising talent and their agents and management companies in the world of sport. Next to Fraser is Freddie Huxtable. Freddie is a private client tax partner at Baker Tilly. Having worked with music business clients, golf, tennis and Formula One personalities, Freddie's primary focus since 1999 has been advising international professional footballers on image rights and wealth planning. And last but by no means least, we have Simon Firth. Simon is the co-head of the Sports Media and Entertainment Group at Maples and Calder. He has extensive experience advising owners, sports bodies, athletes and broadcasters on all aspects of sports-related transactions, including athlete wealth management structures and the ownership and licensing of image rights. Now, before we kick off, I'd just like to do a very brief bit of housekeeping. There will be an opportunity at the end to ask any questions. We only have a relatively short amount of time, so if you do have any questions on image rights, please do bear them in mind and we will do our best to answer them at the end of the session. So to get started, to bring us all onto the same page, we all have a notion of what image rights are, but what do we actually mean when we talk about image rights in the football context? And I'm going to ask Fraser perhaps to lead a discussion on what we really mean by this concept.
Thanks, Matt. Can you hear me, everybody? Is this cool? Hear me? Okay. Yeah. Image right is the sort of industry term used effectively for a player, footballer's commercial rights. So it's the hodgepodge of rights connected with a player on the commercial side. So his name, likeness, image, and the right for someone to use that in a commercial context. So we divide normally image rights into two types. One is passive rights, and that's the right to use a name, image, or likeness, and into active rights, which is the right to use a player or footballer for promotional appearances, etc. Now, image rights have been about in the industry now for probably 20 so years or longer, but in about year 2000, the Premier League here in England, they introduced some standard Clause 4 rights. So in the Premier League contract, the club is given what are called some rights under Clause 4 to use the player in his image rights in a club context. So a standard football relationship will be the player can be obliged to provide certain obligations to the club under Clause 4. Now what's happened as football has developed its profile, etc., and players' profile have developed as well, is now you see some real value in image rights. So as a result, you find now with certain players, there is a separate image rights contract as well as a playing contract. Now that is done normally where the club is paying additional money for additional rights over and above the Clause 4 rights, or is renegotiating some of the Clause 4 rights. And particularly now, I think we're seeing, due to financial fair play and clubs are now beefing up their commercial departments, they see real value in image rights. So as a result, when you have a negotiation with a player who's joining a club, there's also quite a detailed negotiation in relation to the player's image rights and the ability of the club to use those rights for the benefit of themselves and their own commercial partners. And I think we were talking beforehand how much this has evolved really, because in my own experience, 10 years ago, when you were negotiating an image rights contract for a player, it probably was only about maybe 1 or 2 pages long, if that. But now, particularly with the bigger clubs, you may have image rights contracts up to 30 or 40 pages long, dealing with the detail and the rights and restrictions involved with the use of the player's image rights by the club. And the big area really is in terms of what rights the club has and what individual rights the player has to be able to do his own personal deals. And obviously the club's concern is they don't conflict with their own commercial partners. So this has become quite an area of interest and obviously of value to both players and clubs alike, and now forms an important part of the negotiation.
Thank you, Fraser. Just pause there. You obviously mentioned commercial rights and how they've evolved over the years. Perhaps, Freddie, I know you've been in the game a little while now, without giving the game away completely, but could you perhaps bring us up to speed with how image rights were used initially to get money, to bring monetary value to the table, and how perhaps they've evolved into something else and what that encompasses in today's market?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think if someone wants to correct me in the audience, then please go ahead, but I think where you first saw image rights, if you go back in time, is probably in the US and developing in other sports such as golf and tennis and areas like that, more where there's a sort of something akin to a self-employment, and maybe where the business management in the States was a little bit more active in generating deals for sports personalities. And in many ways, football was quite low profile until the Premier League came to the fore in the 90s. If you go back to the 60s and you think of a player like George Best, I saw a bit of the previous presentation, which is why he comes to mind. I mean, there's a classic image there, isn't there? Okay, it went off a bit in the end, but there was no exploitation of his image in those days. It just wasn't even thought about. Whereas now, I think possibly, like I say, driven by the more commercially minded people originally in the US, agents here and internationally have picked up on the concept of their players being a valuable commodity over and above what they do on the pitch. Maybe what they do on the pitch enhances the opportunities with commercial organisations, whether that's the club and using the player as an icon within the club or beyond that. So you naturally see that development where it comes into the Premier League, probably in the late 90s. And in addition to that, you know, the drive for clubs to raise more commercial revenue, whether it's for financial fair play or just to be able to compete off the pitch in terms of their income that they receive and then spend it on player wages, that's where image rights have come to the fore in a club context, but have been more focused in relation to the individual players.
So can we drill down on some of the details? So what were you seeing to start with in terms of what rights were being put or made subject to contracts, and some of the more sort of at the other end of the spectrum, what we're seeing now?
Well, I think in the early days you'd have a situation like, let's do an image rights contract. No one really knew what that meant, and people would just set up a company and money would flow into the company. Now, for any of you involved in it today, I mean, in a sense, it's much more professional, it's much more organised in that you identify what the rights are, you have all the paperwork to support that, because not least of which, we've got the Inland Revenue looking over our shoulders to make sure we do everything properly, and will probably try and tax us if we don't do it right. So I think, to pick up on Fraser's point, you have a couple of pages in a document, 10 years or so ago. Now you've got much more considered documents. Each clause is well negotiated apart from the standard boilerplates, so that where you're getting clubs making sure they're getting the exact rights that they want, they're stopping players going off and doing their own deals in certain areas that may conflict with club rights. So you do need that team of people around to fully understand what this bundle of rights is all about. And of course, within the UK, not speaking as a lawyer, but as a layman in that regard, there's no such thing as an image right per se. It's a bundle of rights. So that's what you've got to be sort of careful about and aware of.
And that's in the UK. What about internationally, and what we're seeing perhaps outside the UK? Simon, can you perhaps elaborate on some of the things that you're seeing elsewhere?
Certainly. Going back to what Fraser said originally, the original two-page contract was basically a negotiation by agents and players to seek revenue for the non-playing work they did for a club, and originally that came with some resistance. Nowadays it's almost 180 degrees, where and certainly on the international, outside of the Premiership certainly, what we're seeing is clubs are actually looking for an interest in the player's image rights separate to what he does for the club. So the players' own sponsorship deals are becoming part of what the clubs want a part in. And so we're seeing that as a development on the international scale, more so in the other leagues than we are in the Premiership. But I think that's an evolution that we're going to see through into the Premiership soon.
So what I'm hearing at the moment is there's two distinct interest groups. You've got club and you've got player. So where are the commercial sort of opportunities in image rights today? Perhaps taking the club perspective first. So Andy, could you perhaps give us an insight of how people should
Good
arrange
evening, everyone.
themselves?
I think probably going the evolution piece is the first guise of image rights was this whole thing of clause 4, which was a very basic. You get a certain amount of time for PR, a certain amount of time for commercial partnerships, and then the ability to the licensing, sell shirts and things you'd generally see in the megastore. And I think, at that point, the clubs were very, very short-staffed. I remember starting, we had a commercial director, a head of sponsorship, and these contracts were negotiated by chief exec, financial director, and external lawyers, and so it was kind of passed down the chain. And what you see now is, with FFP and with clubs having to monetize every single area of the business that they can. You've got a stadium that's a certain size, you've got broadcasting revenue that's a certain amount, and you've got your ticketing and hospitality you can go to. But so where are the other areas of growth, the commercial areas? And so for clubs, where is that going to take you? It's going to take you to the players, which is potentially your most valuable asset. And so you're going beyond just licensing. You're starting to see that obviously they pick up deals on the international stage, and the most valuable area for individuals is generally around the international tournaments. So it enhances this sort of clause 4 for the club to be able to then start making money, say for a Brazilian around a Brazilian World Cup, or for an African around the African Cup of Nations, or and perhaps there's Asian opportunities in access in Asia, or on tours, or on other areas. So it brings in that kind of individual context, so that the clubs are beginning to benefit from the Pepsi board deals, or from the the other arrangements, EA Sports or whatever, that historically have always been around the players, and maybe not so much the clubs. There's also that area now starting to enhance club sponsor agreements and getting the players to perform more under their club commercial partners. I think Liverpool have done some stuff with Nivea recently, where you're seeing the players kind of in a slightly different context, which you wouldn't have seen previously. There's potentially, as I mentioned, about opening up other markets. So if you've got an African player, you're going to start trying to push in that market, or another area. There's also the other areas that the players coming in potentially could be aligned with a one-man band and an individual agent. And so the clubs now have got resources in Asia. They could be other areas. So you're having to enhance the work which the agent does, and support what they're doing. So these other offices are beginning to deliver more commercial revenue and sort of tap into local markets. And that's I think there's also young players. There's potential around these guys. Get them young, so you're not paying as much for the image rights, and see them advance, and working with them and building that relationship with the players as they develop into a first team player. Other areas which probably will start going, you're seeing teams touring more, so maybe there's more individual access on individual tours, so that fans in other markets can see players in the flesh and not just see it on TV. So you may see off-season trips. And another area which I think is still developing is this whole content. What is engaging content? What is the value of content? And where does the line start between what is individual content and what is club rights? So they start talking about a match which is a team match, or are they talking about their own personal life and having a coffee in the morning as they get up? So there's a whole host of areas that now these agreements are beginning to move into, far beyond clause 4, and start wrapping all of these rights, which are part of a new 30-40 page image rights agreement.
So without giving away sort of trade secrets, do you think clubs should be doing anything in particular to view or get the most out of the commercial opportunities associated with image rights?
Well, I mean, the key thing for the club is securing rights that are valuable. You know, I think in the early days, you know, the savvy agents were cutting out their home markets, were, you know, sort of securing certain categories or doing things which they knew are obvious targets for endorsements. You know, you'll see boot categories, you see sports drinks or games or other things, and they were trying to ring fence that. So I think the club's getting valuable commercial rights and then having the resource to go out and exploit it, because at the end of the day it's one thing having a contract, but you actually need to go out and exploit it and take it to market so you can commercialise.
Okay, so we've now heard about the club perspective. What about the player perspective and how they should be seeing image rights in the most commercially?
I think a common mistake for agents of players is sometimes they enter into image rights arrangements and don't appreciate the rights that they've ceded, and you can be in a situation sort of 6 months, a year down the line and suddenly realise that you can't actually do a deal in that sector because actually you've actually agreed that you cannot do a deal in the sectors of all the club partners. And some clubs, you know, they can have up to 20 commercial partners, which wipes out most of the main product sectors. So I think players and agents have to be increasingly aware to this, and when they enter into negotiations, actually the clubs want these rights now, and even though they're getting a commercial fee, they have to work out, is that commercial fee justified in terms of the revenues they're going to cede in return. And I've seen, you know, a few times the fact that actually the revenues they've received does not compensate for the monies they could have earned individually. So I think that's an increasing trend to be careful of.
So it sounds like as well there's a little bit of tension now between player and club. Do you see any issues around this tension, or
no, it's not tension. I just think it's the fact is, as I think Andy and Freddie alluded to, is that image rights are valuable. You know, players, high profile, particularly the leading players, sponsors want a piece of them. They want to promote their brand, and you know the clubs with FFP want to boost up their commercial revenues. You know, Manchester United and Man City cases in point, and so they want to get these rights. And they don't want their star players entering into competing deals with their sponsors.
I think there's also a disconnect between a situation where you have a sudden transfer, or if the agent or the people around the player aren't properly advised or thinking about what they're doing, that they just don't think about the detail of the rights. There's a heads of terms that's prepared, and when you come to do a long form license agreement, then things come up that weren't even considered, and then that's where you get this disconnect between what the club thinks it's got and what the player or the agent believes they still have to be able to market.
Yeah, because a lot of times when a deal's done, the devil's always in the detail, and a lot of detail can be very important. And sometimes representatives don't quite realise, again, the detail can lead to sacrificing quite significant revenues. So yeah, it's not a conflict, but it's just a contested negotiation over valuable rights.
I think it's an evolution of sophistication on both sides. The clubs are now understanding that there's more value to be made from the players that they're signing from other contracts that are not related to their footballing playing, and the agents and players are understanding that actually there's a revenue source there that they need to protect. As Fraser was saying, sometimes they don't always get the most out of that. I think that's again evolving to the point that both sides fully understand what's at stake, and that's leading to 40-page contracts.
So what about the future of image rights? Where do you see image rights going? Where do you think the commercial opportunities may be in the future? It's a generally open question. Perhaps Andy would like to lead on this from there.
Well, I think the whole notion is that with clubs and players coming closer together, the opportunity is sort of as a collective, more so than trying to individually fight the market and go out on your own, because the clubs are much bigger now. The reach is there. They're the guys who are putting them on the pitch week in, week out. They're the guys who have got the digital and the media communication teams at the training ground day in, day out. And they've got the sponsor. I think there's going to be that sort of finding more creative ways to exploit that. And then I guess from the club point of view, I mean, this may go slightly against the players in the sense that the club will think they're buying the rights and protecting their partners. And there's always that sort of balance in terms of you do if you've got the image rights to a player and you do a deal with a sponsor, you are getting it's effectively a commission on that deal, and it's a knockdown commission, but as part of a smaller package. Whereas you do a sponsorship deal, you get the whole lot potentially. And I mean that's a bit of a very general way of looking at it. But I think the power of the club marks and the individual and the club kits. You got to be careful of devaluing that. But there's definitely you see more regional partnerships coming out from clubs, and you see more access to talent and more adverts going into those markets. And I think that slowly sort of detracts from maybe some of the individual deals you used to get when you got sort of 2-3 year deals out of Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand, because the guy was a well-known Premier League footballer.
Okay. And what about pitfalls? We've obviously covered the opportunities. Do you think there's any pitfalls to keep an eye out for?
Well, I think what you have to watch out for, I mean, image rights and the commercial income derived therefrom, I think is here to stay and can only grow if it's properly used. But one of my mottos is right player, right club. You can't have an image rights contract on an unknown player at an unknown small club. I just don't think that works. And I think the revenue, if you want to take it to that stage, would actually not like that either. I mean, they've issued some guidelines for the Premier League, and in a way that's sensible, because even the revenue acknowledge that image rights exist. They've even got stuff in their inland revenue manuals about image rights. And I think the crucial thing there is they know they're not going to go away, but it's all about making sure that the structures are set up properly. It's all very well to do the commercial deals, but you've got to have the infrastructure to go with it, and the deals have to be commercial. They're not a tax device or a tax avoidance device, which is why right player, right club has the right ring about it. So if you've got a Chelsea player at Chelsea, which has got an image rights department that's looking to develop and build on its global brand, then you have an international player that all seems to fit to me. Then it's just about how much those rights are worth and what that player's going to do to help build that brand.
And what about actually allocating a value to the image rights? Is that too difficult a question to ask, or is it a case-by-case basis? Is there a rule of thumb?
From a commercial point of view, it's what someone will pay.
Exactly. And from an inland revenue valuation point of view, it's a willing buyer, willing seller in a hypothetical market, which doesn't mean anything to anybody, does it? what the commercial price is.
Yes, can you justify the commercial value? That's what it comes down to.
Going back to your question about the future, I think that may resolve itself, because I think one evolution that we are starting to see, and we may see more of, is players actually taking control of their image rights and selling them separately to their contracts with the clubs, either through a securitization or some other form of prepayment for a bundle of rights that they have in themselves. And so the market will dictate the price there.
Do you think there are any issues with that, or do you think they'll
there will inevitably be issues with that, not least because I think that starts to get us into the interesting third-party ownership discussion again. This isn't pure third-party ownership in terms of what FIFA's legislated against recently, but you have the potential for some of your star players selling the rights in themselves and the sponsorship deals to a third party who owns them. That third party has no control over a transfer, or not part of the transfer negotiation, and not part of the sale proceeds in terms of the transfer, but they are an interested party, and therefore they'll want to be around the table. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I'm conscious that we've talked about quite a few points here, so I thought it would make sense to open up to the floor to see if anyone's got any questions, and if they'd like to pose anything to our special ones. Is there a microphone in the room?
Yes, hello, I'm Risto Oksanen from Finnish Football League. What if there's a situation that a smaller club and a young player and they don't do any image right contract? How does it work that way? Does the club have a right to use the images or not?
Yeah, because if it's, take for example the Premier League, then in the standard contract there is, under clause 4, the club is granted these standard rights by the player. So without the image rights contract, the club gets these standard rights, club context rights. So you don't need an additional image rights contract.
Yes. And how about the league?
How about?
how about the league? How about the Premier League or lower leagues, say in the Premiership? Does the league have any rights?
Does the league, yes, under the clause 4, it gets certain rights, yeah.
The players who sign the image rights agreement, it's generally those who have assigned their individual rights to a company. So hence you have an image rights agreement. Otherwise you're just signing a normal playing contract which has clause 4, which has protection for the league partner, protection for the club's principal partners and so on. So it's just kind of an evolution of that process really.
There's effectively a default position with a pure player contract.
And that doesn't stop players going off and doing their own things, like locally opening I don't know, a stadium or something, or a venue, or indeed a boot deal, which is the more obvious one, because that in a sense is a sort of image rights contract. It's mainly a performance-based contract of wearing the boots, but there may be also some personal appearances required, or you know, the use of a photograph of the player or something by the boot company.
Can you? I'm diLJO6Ty8h4 from Nigeria. What do you do in a situation where the image right of a player clashes with that of the club? For instance, recently you had Wayne Rooney advertising a Nike shirt when he was congratulating what's his name, Schweinsteiger, on his birthday with a Nike shirt. Meanwhile, Man U was supposed to launch a kit with Adidas the next day. Will such players be penalized, or how do you go around it?
There's no, with all of the image rights contracts, each one is a separate negotiation. So each one will have a different slightly twist on a fairly standard base. And when it comes to things like the sportswear things, it's been quite a well-trodden path in terms of Adidas, Nike, Puma all coexisting within the clubs. So, you know, I think, you know, they try and sort of keep very much in the club context, and obviously you're not going to, they'll try and protect them wearing a red Nike outfit that mirrors what he's wearing on the field or something like that. I mean, you see it more of a challenge with the Nike and the Adidas piece when you're going around FIFA and UEFA, when players are sort of trying to do an advertisement for a car manufacturer who's sponsoring UEFA, and they happen to be sponsored by Nike, and Nike got a contract with the individual that says he's got to be in Nike athletic gear when he's doing anything football related, and the sponsor saying we can't do that because Adidas are a sponsor of the tournament. So, you know, I think in the club it's well trodden, and it's kind of, it's not perfect, but people protect it. I think, you know, you find that lower down the pyramid of sponsors, they're a bit more relaxed. So, you know, you've got your principal partner, you've got your shirt sponsor, you've got, you know, training wear. You know, these guys tend to be quite well protected within image rights agreements per se, and certainly the more recent editions of them. But perhaps if they've got a regional banking deal with BNI in Indonesia, that's a bad example because of Barclays, but you know, they have a regional deal with a smaller brand in the same category, they might be more relaxed because it's only in an individual capacity. The player shouldn't be talking about club business, and it should only be, you know, his likeness, you know, outside of that.
I think it perhaps comes back to a point that Fraser made earlier, where the devil really is in the detail. So what does the contract precisely say? And
but with the general principle, but custom is a player is always going to have his own boot deal, and so even if it clashes, which happens a lot with the club kit supplier, he'll always be permitted to have that deal. But the difference, as Andy said, it's his club deal is in a club context, and his individual is in a personal context. So there's always these clashes, but it's permitted. When you mentioned Schweinsteiger, what was the Nike element of the deal? Because it's Adidas and Adidas, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, because, well, Man United just introduced the Adidas shirts, haven't they?
Man United had launched the Adidas
Yeah.
jersey, but not formally. They were supposed to launch it the next day. But the day before, he congratulated...
The day before, right, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Yeah, he's because that's in a club capacity, so he's okay with Adidas, so there's no... Yeah.
There was also an interesting photograph of Cesc Fabregas on Sport magazine in London, which is a freebie. I think it goes out in other parts of the country as well. And being a Chelsea player, he's Adidas in a club context, but this photograph of Cesc on the front cover of Sport magazine showed him wearing Puma. So presumably his boot deal and everything else is with Puma, and presumably there was no problem with that.
No.
Yeah.
Yes. Any more questions?
Hi, Diego Valdez from Sports Business Institute. I just had a question. For example, if you have a player who has a personal endorsement deal with, say, a beer brand, and then all of a sudden this player is an international player. He plays in a FIFA tournament, wins the player or the man of the match, sponsored by Budweiser. What can the company that sponsors the player do in that regard to protect itself so that the player does not appear, or I mean, he's obviously going to have to appear with the trophy, the Budweiser trophy. So, can the beer brand that sponsors or that endorses or that is endorsing the player, can they do anything at all, or is that just par for the course?
Yeah. Normally, for that example, so the player's got a personal deal with a beer brand. Now he'll normally be able to do beer deals on a club capacity. So if his club had a beer sponsor, then he'll be able to do that. That wouldn't conflict with his personal deal, and he should in his contract be able to do that. And secondly, in a national capacity, if he's playing for the national team and there's another beer sponsor involved there, he should be able to do that as well. So normally you try and ensure that he has these three different layers: national team, club, and personal. So he should be able to do that. But if he was, in the example you gave with the trophy, in a national team capacity, you want to make sure he's with at least one or two or three other players and not on his own in that promotion. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I was just saying that when it's the man of the match, it's typically
the man of the match. Yeah, well, provided the advertisement doesn't infer that he's personally endorsing that brand. That is, it's a very fine line, I agree, but that's the sort of protection. So if they use this advert globally with him saying, so-and-so supports our brand, we're very proud, you could argue he's personally endorsing it. But if it's man of the match by Budweiser, sponsor of the World Cup, then you could argue it should be okay. But there's a fine line, and that's where creative advertising comes in. And you can always, but generally it should be okay, provided they don't insinuate that he's sponsoring their brand. Yeah?
Thank you.
Any more questions? Well, I think that's probably all we have time for anyway, so thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for our panellists. For their insights. We're all going to be in the conference and around the conference the next few days, so if you do have any follow-up questions, please do come and seek them out. But thank you all. Have a good evening.